Ethan Matthews stared out the window of the bustling cafe that doubled as his and Julia's first office. Just 3 years ago, they had started this business with nothing but ambition and a vision. Now, their marketing firm, Brightwave Creative, had grown into one of the city's top boutique agencies. From helping local bakeries craft their first campaigns to landing national brands, their teamwork had been the secret sauce to their success. Ethan reflected on how much their lives had changed since those early days. Back then, they worked out of his cramped one-bedroom apartment, using a folding table as a desk. He remembered late nights fueled by instant coffee and optimism. Julia curled up on the couch editing proposals, while he brainstormed ideas on the whiteboard they'd bolted to the living room wall. They'd celebrated their first major client win by splitting a bottle of cheap champagne, laughing and dreaming about what the future might hold. It wasn't just business. Ethan and Julia had built their personal lives together, too. They were weeks away from their wedding, an event Julia had meticulously planned down to the color of the napkins. She handled details with the same precision she brought to work. It was one of the things Ethan had admired most about her. But as much as he admired her drive, there were moments when he felt overwhelmed by her intensity. Julia approached everything in life as though it were a problem to be solved, a task to be perfected. Ethan, on the other hand, thrived on creativity and spontaneity. He loved dreaming up big-picture ideas, while Julia excelled at executing them. They complemented each other perfectly, or so he'd believed. That morning, Ethan was finalizing a pitch for a high-profile client, their biggest yet, Titan Apparel. Securing this deal would catapult Brightwave into a new league, one where they could finally hire more staff and scale back their own endless hours. As he reviewed the proposal, Julia walked in, phone in hand, typing furiously. "Ethan, we need to go over the client's demographic data again. I just noticed some gaps," she said. Her tone clipped. Ethan glanced up. "I've already triple-checked it. Solid. Trust me." She frowned, setting her phone on the table. "I'd feel better if we reviewed it together. This pitch has to be perfect." "And it will be," he replied, holding her gaze. "You've got to trust me on this." Julia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she perched on the edge of the desk and began scrolling through her phone, the tension between them palpable. Ethan sighed and pulled the file back up on his laptop. He loved Julia, but her need for control often turned collaboration into a battle. Still, he reminded himself this was just who she was. They were partners in business and in life. They could weather anything together, or so he thought. Later that day, as they rehearsed the pitch in their small conference room, Julia's perfectionism flared again. She interrupted Ethan repeatedly, nitpicking his phrasing and tweaking the slides he'd spent hours perfecting. By the end of the session, Ethan's patience was wearing thin. "I think it's good enough," he said finally, trying to keep his tone even. "We're ready." "Good enough," Julia shot back, her voice sharp. "This isn't about being good enough, Ethan. This is our future." Her words stung, though he tried not to show it. "I know that, but sometimes you have to trust that we've done our best and let it go." Julia didn't respond, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Ethan forced a smile and suggested they call it a day, hoping the distance would ease the strain between them. As he packed up his laptop, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Julia's drive, once inspiring, now felt relentless, and he couldn't tell if it was the stress of the wedding, the pitch, or something deeper. On the way home, Ethan replayed the day's events in his mind. He told himself they were just under pressure, that once the Titan deal and the wedding were behind them, things would settle down. But as he parked the car outside their apartment, a sliver of doubt crept in. What if their perfect partnership wasn't as perfect as he thought? What if cracks were beginning to show, ones he hadn't been ready to see? He shook the thoughts away as he climbed the stairs, determined to focus on the positives. After all, they had built something incredible together. Whatever challenges they faced, they would handle them together. Ethan woke the next morning to the hum of Julia's voice in the next room. She was on a call early as usual. He could tell by her clipped tone that it was business-related. Sliding out of bed, He shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee, her words drifting through the apartment. "Yes, I'll handle that directly," she was saying. "And no, there's no need to loop Ethan in. I'll take care of it." Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. Why wouldn't she loop him in? They were partners. She always looped him in. Dismissing the unease bubbling in his chest, he told himself there was probably a good reason. Maybe it was something minor, something that didn't require his attention. By the time Julia ended her call and joined him in the kitchen, she was all smiles, acting as though nothing unusual had happened. "Morning," she chirped, kissing his cheek. "Did you sleep okay?" "Yeah," he replied, studying her. "Who was that on the phone?" Her expression didn't falter. "Oh, just a vendor issue. Nothing major." He nodded slowly, but the seed of doubt planted itself deeper. The day unfolded like any other, with back-to-back meetings and an endless stream of emails. Yet, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Julia seemed distracted during their team huddle, her focus elsewhere as he presented updates on the Titan pitch. When he asked her opinion on a crucial detail, she snapped out of her reverie and gave a generic response, one that felt uncharacteristically disengaged. That evening, Ethan stayed late at the office to tweak the final slides for the pitch. Julia had left early, claiming she needed to meet a friend for dinner. Alone in the quiet office, Ethan found himself scrolling through the shared project folder, reviewing Julia's contributions. Everything looked fine, better than fine. She'd polished their strategy to perfection. Yet, he couldn't shake the memory of her phone call that morning. As he was packing up to leave, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email thread forwarded by one of their junior associates. At first glance, it seemed routine, until Ethan spotted a line that made his stomach drop. Julia mentioned this was her solo project, but let me know if you need access to the files. Solo project? Ethan's mind raced. There were no solo projects at Brightwave. They made every decision together. Pulling up the thread, he scoured the emails for more context, his pulse quickening with every line. Julia had been coordinating directly with the Titan executives, making decisions behind his back. She'd even excluded him from key communications. A cold weight settled in Ethan's chest. Why would she do this? They'd always been a team. Was she trying to sideline him? Or was there something else he wasn't seeing? When he arrived home, Julia was already in bed, her laptop perched on her knees as she typed away. She glanced up when he walked in. "Hey, you're late." "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tying up loose ends." She nodded, her attention already back on her screen. Ethan stood there for a moment, debating whether to confront her. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he climbed into bed beside her, the unspoken questions weighing heavy between them. As Julia turned off the lamp and rolled onto her side, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but the evidence said otherwise. For the first time, he wondered if he could truly trust the woman he was about to marry. Ethan couldn't focus at work the next day. The email thread from the night before replayed in his mind like a broken record. Julia's words, her solo project, echoed with a sharp sting of betrayal. He tried to convince himself there had to be a mistake, some misunderstanding that would explain everything. Yet, the growing weight in his chest suggested otherwise. By lunchtime, he decided he needed clarity. He picked up his phone, scrolling to Julia's contact, his thumb hovering over the call button. But before he could press it, a knock sounded at his office door. "Come in," Ethan said, sliding his phone onto the desk. Their junior associate, Kelly, stepped inside, holding a stack of papers. "Hey, Ethan. I just wanted to double-check something about the Titan proposal." "Sure," he said, gesturing for her to sit. As Kelly spread the papers out, Ethan's gaze lingered on the folder in her hands. It was labeled Titan Apparel, Direct Access. Direct Access? He furrowed his brow. That label implied private correspondence with the client. Ethan had assumed everything related to Titan was shared between him and Julia. Yet here was another sign of hidden communication. "Kelly, just out of curiosity," Ethan said, keeping his tone light, When you mentioned Julia's solo project in the email last night, what exactly did you mean? Kelly blinked, clearly caught off guard. Oh, I just meant she was the primary contact for the Titan team. She said it would streamline things, so all updates and decisions went through her. Ethan's heart sank. Did she say why she was handling it alone? She didn't get into details, Kelly said, biting her lip. I assumed it was something you both agreed on. Ethan forced a smile. Right? Thanks, Kelly. That clears it up. As she left the room, Ethan leaned back in his chair, the pieces clicking into place. Julia hadn't just excluded him from minor updates. She'd taken control of their biggest client behind his back. But why? He spent the rest of the afternoon going through their shared drive, combing through emails, project notes, and client correspondence. What he found only confirmed his suspicions. Julia had been negotiating terms with Titan without consulting him. She'd even adjusted the profit-sharing percentages in their agreement, lowering Brightwave's cut in exchange for a personal retainer paid directly to her. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan's mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? What else had she hidden from him? That evening, he drove home in silence, his grip on the steering wheel tight. When he arrived, the apartment was dark, save for a dim glow coming from Julia's home office. He walked inside, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. As he approached her door, he heard voices, Julia's, along with someone else's. I'm telling you, this is my opportunity, Julia was saying, her tone sharp and determined. Ethan doesn't need to know the details. Once the deal's finalized, it won't matter. Ethan froze, his hand on the doorknob. His pulse thundered in his ears as he strained to hear the response. Are you sure you can keep him out of it? The other voice asked. It sounded like one of their industry contacts. Mark from Titan. Of course, Julia replied. Ethan's too trusting. He'll never suspect a thing. Ethan felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. Every doubt, every unease he'd felt over the past weeks, crystallized into cold, hard truth. Julia wasn't just taking charge of the Titan deal. She was cutting him out entirely. He didn't remember leaving the apartment. By the time he came to his senses, he was sitting in his car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The betrayal burned through him like fire. This wasn't just about business. It was personal. Julia had lied to him, manipulated him, and made a mockery of their partnership. For hours, Ethan sat there, staring into the night. He thought about the years they'd spent building Brightwave, the countless sacrifices they'd made together. He thought about the wedding they'd been planning, the future they'd envisioned. All of it felt tainted now, a facade hiding the cracks beneath. When he finally returned to the apartment, Julia was already asleep. Ethan stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her for a long moment. She looked so peaceful, so composed, so unlike the person who had just plotted to betray him. Ethan climbed into bed beside her, though sleep didn't come. His mind churned with anger, sadness, and a deep, aching sense of loss. He didn't know how to confront her yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this. Julia had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Ethan made a silent vow to himself. He would uncover the full extent of Julia's deceit, and he would fight to reclaim what was rightfully his. Whether it was the business, their relationship, or his own sense of self-worth, he wouldn't let her destroy everything they'd built. Ethan couldn't avoid the truth anymore. Julia's evasiveness, her solo dealings with Titan, the widening gap between them. It all pointed to something far deeper than just stress or miscommunication. Over the next week, he quietly began digging deeper, looking for answers. At the office, he stayed late, combing through their shared files and emails. On one such night, while scanning through the project logs, he stumbled upon something buried deep within the digital archives. An unsigned draft of a contract between Julia and Titan Apparel. His heart sank as he read through it. The document outlined terms for a new marketing agency, one Julia would lead independently. The language was clear. Titan was offering her an exclusive retainer if she left Brightwave and worked for them directly. What's worse, the document included references to strategies and assets Ethan had helped build over the years. She was using their work, their intellectual property, as leverage to secure a deal for herself. Ethan clenched his fists. He tried to breathe deeply, but his chest felt tight, his mind reeling. This wasn't just deceit. This was a betrayal of everything they'd built together, a betrayal of him. Unable to focus, Ethan drove home that night, hoping to find clarity. But when he arrived, Julia wasn't there. Her office door was ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. Out of habit, he stepped closer and noticed her laptop open on the desk. A calendar invite flashed on the screen. Meeting with Titan Apparel Confidential. The meeting was set for the following morning. Ethan's pulse quickened. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. As he stood there, staring at the screen, he heard the jingle of keys at the door. Julia walked in, balancing a takeout bag in one hand and her phone in the other. "Hey," she said, her voice casual as she set the bag on the counter. "You're home early." Ethan turned to face her, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I found something interesting at the office tonight," he began, his voice tight. Julia froze for a split second before recovering, her expression neutral. "Oh? What's that?" "A draft contract," he said, stepping closer. "Between you and Titan." Her eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise. "Ethan, it's not what you think." "What is it then?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been cutting me out. You've been negotiating behind my back, planning to leave the company we built together. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me." Julia sighed, setting her phone down. "It's complicated, okay?" Titan approached me directly. They wanted someone who could take their brand to the next level, and they weren't interested in working with a team. They wanted me specifically. "And you didn't think to discuss this with me?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with anger. "We're supposed to be partners, Julia. Not just in business, but in life. How could you hide this from me?" Her gaze hardened. "I didn't tell you because I knew how you'd react. You'd try to talk me out of it or worse, sabotage the deal. I've worked too hard to let that happen." Ethan stared at her, stunned. "So that's it? Everything we've built, everything we've planned, it doesn't matter to you anymore? The wedding, the business, us?" "Of course it matters," Julia snapped. "But I've sacrificed just as much as you have, maybe more. And for what? So I can play second fiddle while you take all the credit? I deserve this opportunity, Ethan. I'm tired of waiting for you to catch up to where I want to be." Her words hit him like a slap. For years, he'd believed they were a team, equals working toward the same goals. But now he saw the truth. Julia didn't see him as a partner. She saw him as an obstacle. The tension in the room was suffocating. Ethan felt a mix of anger, heartbreak, and a deep, gnawing sense of loss. "You could have had everything," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "We could have had everything together. But you chose this. You chose to betray me." Julia's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. For the first time, Ethan saw her for who she truly was. Calculating, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to get ahead, even if it meant destroying the person she claimed to love. That night, Ethan packed a bag and left. He couldn't stay under the same roof, not with the knowledge of what she'd done, and what she was willing to do. As he walked out the door, he felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't the end for him. It was a new beginning. Julia might have betrayed him, but she hadn't broken him. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and doubt for Ethan. Julia continued to act as though everything was fine, but he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. At work, she became increasingly secretive, taking calls behind closed doors and avoiding discussions about the Titan pitch. At home, her demeanor shifted. She was affectionate but distant, like someone trying to play a role they no longer believed in. Ethan decided he couldn't live in limbo any longer. He needed answers. One evening, after Julia had gone to bed, he stayed up in the living room, staring at her laptop on the kitchen counter. The ethical implications of what he was considering made his stomach churn, but the need for the truth outweighed his hesitation. With a deep breath, he opened her laptop and began searching. Her inbox was meticulous, but it didn't take long to find what he was looking for. There, buried in a folder labeled Contracts, was a document that made his blood run cold. It was an agreement between Julia and Titan Apparel, a deal to establish her own agency. The terms were damning. Titan would transfer their account to her new firm, leaving Brightwave behind. Julia had even included a clause claiming sole ownership of several key strategies they had developed together. Ethan couldn't believe what he was reading. She wasn't just betraying him personally. She was dismantling the business they'd built together. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, finding emails between Julia and the Titan executives. She'd painted Ethan as a minor player in the firm, someone who didn't have the vision or leadership skills to take Titan to the next level. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. Ethan closed the laptop and sat in the dark, his thoughts a storm of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. He felt like a fool. For years, he'd believed in their partnership, in their shared dreams. But now he saw the truth. Julia had never been content to share the spotlight. The next morning, Ethan decided he wouldn't confront her outright. Not yet. Instead, he needed to protect himself and the company. At the office, he began quietly gathering evidence, forwarding key documents and emails to his private account. He reached out to their lawyer, framing his concerns as hypothetical questions about intellectual property and partnership agreements. It wasn't until 2 days later that everything came to a head. Ethan arrived at the office early, planning to finalize his preparations before confronting Julia. But as he stepped off the elevator, he heard voices coming from the conference room. "I'll handle the transition," Julia was saying. "Ethan doesn't need to be involved. I've got everything under control." He froze. Peering through the glass door, he saw Julia seated across from 2 Titan executives, folders spread out in front of them. Her expression was confident, almost smug. Anger surged through Ethan. He pushed open the door, startling everyone in the room. "Ethan," Julia said, her voice sharp with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "But I think I already know." The Titan executives exchanged uneasy glances. Julia stood, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Can we talk privately?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We're doing this now." He turned to the executives. "I think you should know that Brightwave is a partnership. Julia doesn't have the authority to make decisions like this on her own." "Ethan," Julia began, but he cut her off. "Save it," he said, his voice cold. "I've seen the contracts, the emails. I know everything, Julia." Her face paled, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms. "You don't understand?" "I understand perfectly," he snapped. "You were willing to betray me, to destroy everything we built together, just to satisfy your own ambition. And you didn't even have the decency to be honest about it." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The Titan executives stood awkwardly, mumbling something about giving them privacy before quickly leaving the room. Once they were gone, Julia turned to Ethan, her facade of confidence cracking. "Ethan, I was going to tell you," she said, her tone pleading. "I just needed to figure out the right way." "There's no right way to do what you've done," he said, his voice breaking. "You lied to me. You lied to our clients. And for what? A bigger paycheck? More control?" Julia's eyes filled with tears, but Ethan felt no sympathy. He'd given her everything. His trust, his love, his partnership, and she'd thrown it all away. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Not with you. Not after this." In the weeks that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild Brightwave. He met with their clients, explaining the situation and assuring them that the firm would continue to deliver the same level of excellence. To his surprise, many of them stayed loyal to him, expressing their admiration for his integrity. Julia, on the other hand, found herself isolated. Titan backed out of their deal, unwilling to risk their reputation by associating with her betrayal. She tried to salvage her career, but word spread quickly in their tight-knit industry. For Ethan, the road ahead wasn't easy. He had to let go of the dreams they'd built together and forge a new path on his own. But as painful as it was, he found a sense of freedom in starting over. One evening, as he stood in the office they'd once shared, Ethan reflected on everything he'd learned. Betrayal had shattered his world, but it had also taught him something invaluable: the importance of staying true to himself. Julia had been his partner, but she wasn't his foundation. That, he realized, was something he had to build on his own. And so, with determination in his heart, Ethan stepped forward into his new beginning, ready to face whatever came next.